Exactly 2 weeks ago today, during a campaign speech that he gave over in New Hampshire, President Trump proposed a new policy. This new policy, it's centered around a little-known executive power, something that was actually stripped away from the presidency about a half century ago. However, according to this new policy proposal from President Trump, he said that he would like to actually restore what's known as the power of impoundment. Here's the relevant part from that speech that was given in New Hampshire.
This was not a healthy situation, was it? Today, I'm proposing another new policy that will help us drain the swamp. To stop Biden's wasteful spending and crippling inflation, I will fight to restore the president's historic impoundment power. A lot of you don't know what that is. For 200 years, the president had the right to block unneeded spending and return the funds directly to the Treasury. They stopped that. Congress unconstitutionally probably attacked the impoundment power in 1974, but it will come back. We're going to bring it back, and we will squeeze the bloated federal bureaucracy, and we'll, instead of just having to just spend it.
Now, if you have never heard before about this power of impoundment, then you are very likely not alone. If right now I went out onto the street and I asked 1,000 people about it, I would be surprised if even one single person knew what it was. And so today, let's go through what the power of impoundment is, how it came to be lost, and what it would mean for the country if President Trump was to indeed restore it. Now, to start with, let's rewind the clock back 50 years to the 1970s. Back then, if you remember, the rate of inflation in this country was just spiraling out of control. And as that was happening, the Nixon administration pinned the blame for this raging inflation on what they called the Credit Card Congress. And along that line, President Nixon attempted to set a limit on government spending in order to try and curb the inflation rate. In this July 1972 New York Times article right here, here's how they describe the situation. Quote, President Nixon appealed to Congress today to protect the economic interest of all American citizens by enacting a $250 billion spending ceiling and threatened to veto any measure he deemed excessive. In his message to Congress, Mr. Nixon said that spending for the fiscal year 1973 was already nearly $7 billion higher than he had planned in his budget. And then they quote President Nixon as saying this, quote, that figure by itself is bad enough, but even more spending appears to be on the way. The inevitable result would be higher taxes and more income-eating inflation in the form of higher prices. I am convinced the American people do not want their family budgets wrecked by higher taxes and higher prices, and I will not stand by and permit such irresponsible action to undermine the clear progress we have made in getting America's workers off the inflation treadmill of the 1960s. And so he essentially warned Congress to not spend in excess of $250 billion. However, what happened was that Congress ignored his warning, and they allocated much more spending into the federal budget. Now, President Nixon, he simply refused to spend the appropriated money. The money was appropriated to be spent by Congress, but Nixon, he simply refused to spend it. This was the power of impoundment. Essentially, he impounded the money that was allocated to be spent by Congress. It's a presidential power that was used for 150 years prior to Nixon, starting all the way back with the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. The idea behind the power of impoundment is that the congressional budget, the money that Congress allocates, is the ceiling. It's the max that the government is allowed to spend. Now, whether they spend that amount is up to the president, but that is the max. However, this all changed under the Nixon administration. That's because after he was weakened politically by the Watergate scandal, President Nixon reluctantly signed a piece of legislation which effectively surrendered the power of impoundment not only for him, but for all presidents moving forward. Here's how this New York Times article from 1974 described the situation. And the article was titled, Congress Gains Wide Budget Role. Quote, President Nixon signed a bill today bringing Congress into the federal budget-making process for the first time and curbing the president's authority to impound authorized funds without congressional consent. In a signing ceremony in the Oval Office, Mr. Nixon signed the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Then, this article quotes President Nixon as saying this during the actual signing ceremony. And as you're listening to this, really keep in mind that during this exact same period of time, Nixon is under active investigation for the Watergate scandal. And so for him, keeping a positive relationship with Congress is of vital importance. And so keep that in mind as you're listening to his statement. Quote, this bill is the most significant reform of budget procedure since Congress began. It means Congress and the executive will work together to keep down the cost of government, and we can help every American family to hold down their budgets. And so, just like that, President Nixon signed away the presidential power of impoundment. turning the office of the president into essentially a rubber stamp implementation mechanism for whatever Congress wants. In a recent interview, here is how Mr. Russ Vought, he was the director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Trump. He was the last director of that agency before the Trump term ended. Here's how he described this action that was taken by President Nixon. Quote, "The concession of impoundment power was the original sin, which ensured the executive branch no longer plays a meaningful role in the appropriations process. The power of the purse has become caricature, where, rather than setting ceilings, Congress now sets spending floors." That is actually pretty well said. After Nixon signed that law, instead of setting the max ceiling for spending, Congress indeed now sets the minimum floor for spending. And so, for instance, if Congress decides to allocate $1.4 trillion of spending in a given fiscal year, that is the baseline amount of spending that will definitely need to happen. All the president has to do is implement it. He can no longer impound any of the money. He needs to spend at least $1.4 trillion. This then led to multiple unique situations during President Trump's term in office, wherein he would sign off on these giant spending bills despite being quote-unquote unhappy about them. Here's how an article in the Real Clear Wire publication, here's how they described it. Quote, "Trump promised he would never sign another bill like this again before putting his signature on a quote-unquote crazy $1.3 trillion spending bill in 2018. 2 years later, he signed another omnibus bill, this one worth $1.4 trillion, that he called quote-unquote disgraceful. Both times, Trump justified voting for the bloated bills conservatives loathe by pointing to increased military spending. However, if the power of impoundment was indeed restored, it would give presidents, once again, the authority to exercise discretion in regards to how much money they spent, regardless of how much they sign off on. And if you remember back to President Trump's term in office, he actually did do something similar to this, similar to the process of impoundment. That was when he froze the almost $400 million in foreign aid that was earmarked for Ukraine, even though those funds were already congressionally appropriated. Now, in doing so, President Trump was accused of violating the very Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974 that was signed into law by President Nixon. And of course, he was later impeached by the House of Representatives over a phone call that he had with President Zelensky concerning that very money. However, according to Mr. Russ Vought, who was again the last director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Trump, this wasn't really an impoundment. That's at least according to him. Here's what he said, quote, "The reason why there wasn't an impoundment over the Ukraine money was because we did not have the authority just to pocket the money and not spend it. If a new paradigm was in place, the administration potentially would have had the ability to go further and pocket the money." He was essentially saying here that President Trump only changed the timetable for this Ukraine money being doled out. And so, with all that as the background, it appears that President Trump is making the restoration of the Presidential Impoundment Authority one of the key platforms that he's running on, saying that it will give him the authority to destroy the quote-unquote deep state.